I'd like to begin by asking Dr. Sowell whether his findings on, so to speak, the upward mobility of IQs runs counter to such findings as are associated with the work of Coleman, Jensen et al.
Certainly Jensen. Both Jensen and his critics seem to me to operate from a premise that there needs to be some unique explanation of the black IQ. And one finds it in environment, one finds it in heredity. What I tried to look at was whether that uniqueness was there in the first place, whether the level of the black IQ or the pattern of the black IQ was significantly different from that of any number of other ethnic groups in the past at a similar stage of their development. What I found was that there was not. Moreover, what I found was that as these various groups began to rise socioeconomically, their IQs also began to rise. One of the most striking things to me was that as of World War I, Jewish soldiers scored well below the national average on mental tests in the Army. Within a decade or so, that had all changed. So that it seemed to me to indicate that these IQ levels are not something that are written in stone, even for a large group, and that as other kinds of developments go on, you expect these kinds of developments also. In Japan, the average IQ has risen 7 points in the past generation. There's also data on black orphans raised by white families. Their average IQ is 106. So that the IQs are not set in concrete by any means.
Compared to what?
The national average of 100.
I see. Uh-huh.
And compared to an average IQ of 85 for black children as a whole. So they're not set in concrete, but neither are they irrelevant.
You tell us that Jews came here and their IQ was at this level, and just a little bit later it rose to this level. This was the impact of America, right, on
Yes.
something you call human capital.
Yeah.
Describe that, would you?
Well, the human capital is simply the whole range of skills, traits, discipline, even physical health that enable people to produce more than other people.
Inherited or learned, or both?
I guess it would have to be mostly learned, but I think, but almost inherited in the sense that every generation raises the next generation. And so it's virtually the same as if it were inherited for most people. Very few people are in situations such as black orphans raised in white families. That happens very rarely. It's not necessarily a matter of individual merit in the sense that if you're born into a culture and into a family where there are certain values, and particularly if there are families that really insist upon those values, where it's not a matter of doing your own thing, then you will grow up with those values and you will have whatever the benefits happen to come along with those values. Many people came in when the Jews came in and faced, for example, with the free public libraries, the free colleges of New York City and so on. Many of these other groups never went near those things, or very seldom. Whereas the Jews, having a history in which learning had a certain place that it did not have in other cultures, it was like a gold mine to them. The minute they saw all of this, they seized upon it. At one time, not only were the Jews a majority at CCNY, they were 20% of the students at Fordham University, which is Catholic.
So that what you're saying is that there was something that catapulted them towards taking advantage of something that our culture provided.
Oh, absolutely.
Therefore, that permitted the ascendancy of their IQ.
Oh, yes.
Which would not have been the case if they had found themselves, say, in Brazil.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, in Israel, I understand that the Sephardic Jews, who have been in the Arab countries for centuries, have lower IQs than the Ashkenazic Jews who have been in Europe and the United States for centuries. So clearly the society has its impact. But it's also true that there are people facing exactly the same situation. For example, youngsters sitting side by side in the same classroom from different groups, living in the same neighborhood, and yet the IQ differences that you'll see will be as large as those among blacks and whites going to school on the opposite sides of town in Mississippi in the Jim Crow era.
Well, now, Ms. Sowell, the scare word in any discussion of race is, of course, the word genetic.
Yes.
Because too often people are delighted to affirm genetic differences, which allow for superior and inferior races and so on and so forth. Now, how, in fact, is one to distinguish between that which is genetic and that which is so impacted culturally, that it might almost have that effect. You speak about the Ashkenazi Jews and the Sephardic Jews, and continuing differentials notwithstanding that the melting pot in Israel is now 40 years old. How do you account for that? And do you run the danger of the word genetic being used metaphorically to mean also hard cultural insisted inclinations?
I guess that my emphasis would of course be on the cultural. The Sephardic Jews, for example, who came to the United States and did not have these centuries in the Arab countries, are not at any disadvantage vis-a-vis Ashkenazic Jews in the United States. I think that's probably true in places like Brazil or Curacao as well. So it would be cultural primarily, at least in my judgment. Now there are those who would attribute it to genetics. I had an argument with someone like that last week. The great problem is these things go so much together, that taking the black population of the Western Hemisphere, those blacks who have a higher percentage of white ancestry have had enormous social advantages historically. In the United States, when there was slavery, the overwhelming bulk of the slaves were black, but 37% of the free blacks were in fact mulattoes, which is in the American definition, half white or more. In Latin America, there are the countries in which more than half of all the free blacks were in fact mulattoes, and in which the great majority of the slaves were black.
And advantages inured to them? Advantages inured to
Oh,
them?
absolutely, enormous. Well, freedom alone would be one big advantage. But even under slavery itself, there were distinctions made between the mulattoes and the blacks. The mulattoes being very often the offspring either of the slave owner or of the overseer, and therefore getting preferential treatment. And so throughout the Western Hemisphere, those people who have higher white ancestry among the black population have been economically, educationally, and otherwise more advanced. And in times past, it was quite common for them to attribute their success to genetics, when in fact they were fairly blatant historical differences. But the question is, how would you then separate out the two things, since they always occur together? Blacks, of course, emerging from slavery had enormous disadvantages, even as compared to people emerging from slavery in other parts of the Western Hemisphere. Because for one thing, in the United States, blacks were not allowed to have any responsibility under slavery. That one of the key ways of holding blacks in slavery at low cost was to keep the people dependent as much as possible. Now, people tried to do that in other parts of the Western Hemisphere. It wasn't as possible, say, in the West Indies, because there weren't enough whites, for example, in the West Indies to matter. So if blacks were going to be fed in the West Indies, they had to be fed by growing their own food.
Like Angola and like the Portuguese colonies compared to, say, South Africa.
Yes. And so therefore the blacks, say, in the West Indies had all sorts of experience growing their own food, selling the surplus in the market, and in fact being responsible for budgeting what they had. Blacks in the United States were deliberately kept from having that. Dependence was seen as the key to holding the slaves down. As blacks emerged from slavery, a minute percentage could read or write, and yet in half a century, over half the black population was literate. An economic historian has called that one of the most remarkable things in history. If you look back to the era prior to the Civil War, when there were free blacks about 500,000 in the United States, they not only were not allowed in the public schools, they were in some states forbidden even to send their children to private schools and had to do so clandestinely. And yet the census of 1850 showed that most free blacks could read and write.